Well, hello, my name's Ken Farr. I'm a dendrologist with the Canadian Forest Service of Natural Resources Canada, and today we're here in the Arboretum of the Central Experimental Farm here in Ottawa to look at trees. And what we'd like to do is select some trees that you might find useful for planting in the urban forest in and around the place where you live. The interesting thing about the Arboretum is that there's a range of very old trees and much younger trees, and of course they come in a range of sizes, which is important for consideration if you're going to be planting trees in an urban area. We'll also be talking a bit about how to identify trees and some of the reasons why certain trees are more useful and more common in urban forests. So I hope you'll enjoy the tour. A good way to look at over 180 different exotic and native tree species would be simply to download the NRCan Canadian Forest Service smartphone app called My Tree. Using that app, you can simply enter your location and you'll see a list of tree species that are possible choices for where you are. The Arboretum is a collection of trees that have been selected from native and exotic specimens. It was originally designed to test how trees would grow at a relatively northern latitude here in Ottawa in central Canada. And so there's an interesting selection of trees that we can look at today, although we'll focus on some of the more common trees that you're most likely to find at nurseries and in the landscape around you. This is a very interesting selection for an urban forest tree. It's called a GINKGO, GINKGO biloba, and it's actually much older than the other trees here in the Arboretum by a good 100 million years. And it's also a very easy tree to identify based on the shape of the leaves. It's also called a maidenhair tree, which is a reference to a maidenhair fern. So a fern, kind of frilly, dichotomously veined leaf, really quite different than the other leaves on the trees we'll see here in the Arboretum. Why is it a good urban selection? The trees are very drought resistant, heat resistant. They're not affected by many diseases or by insects, and in fact they probably existed longer than the insects and diseases that might have attacked them in the past. So as a selection for an urban forest or for a landscape around your house, it's a fairly dependable and safe tree to plant. Now they'll get much larger than this tree over a period of time, but it takes about 1,000 years for them to become really big, so it's a good selection for an urban site. One of the interesting features of GINKGO trees is that they come in pollen-bearing and seed-bearing separate trees. And you won't often find fruit-bearing trees, fruit-bearing GINKGOs, and it's really not a fruit at all, in the horticultural selection. When the fruit falls off the tree, it creates a kind of an odor that is not particularly enjoyable. However, all of the trees, most of the trees that are sold from nurseries and in horticulture are pollen-bearing trees, and then you don't have that issue. So one of the few trees we're going to look at that comes in Mr. and Mrs. GINKGO. So this is an eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. As the name suggests, it's strictly an eastern tree. It occurs in Canada essentially from eastern Quebec and the Maritimes through to about Lake of the Woods. But it's also a standard urban planting across Canada in terms of city selections for trees and shrubs. So why is it planted across Canada? It's a fairly dependable urban tree, except they're prone to drought at some points. They're beautiful, fast-growing tree, and you can identify them on the basis of the needles that are in bundles of 5. So when you look at a a pine tree, the needles, the leaves come in bundles of 2, 3, or 5. In the case of white pine, eastern white pine, they're in bundles of 5. As you'll notice from the form of the tree, it's very modular. There are no branches growing between the main whorls of branches, so you can effectively count the age of the tree by counting those whorls from bottom to top. In terms of size, they are very large trees, and you need a big space to plant them. So if you look behind this tree at the large trees in the background, those are actually the same species, eastern white pine, and they're by no means as large as they're going to get over a period of 200 to 300, 400 years, but you can see that even at 70 to 100 years old, they do get to be quite big. So you do need to think about space available for planting trees in and around your house. So eastern white pine, an important tree in terms of the history of eastern Canada and the development of the forest industry, and now a very main component of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, and fairly common as an urban forest tree as well. This is a red maple, Acer rubrum. It's one of about 10 species of maples that grow in Canada, several of which show up consistently in the urban forest. The one species you think of, sugar maple, Acer saccharum, is actually not a very good urban tree. It doesn't do well in drought, it doesn't like salt, and it doesn't like compacted soil, which is what one tends to find in urban sites. The red maple is a fairly good urban tree. More often than not now you'll find a hybrid of silver maple and red maple, which is called a Freeman maple. But this is one of the starting points for that hybrid, red maple. And it's interesting in that this is a fairly old tree. It's probably 100 years old or more. And you can start to see the consistency of the bark, which is actually very characteristic from one species to another. And this tree has long fissured strips of bark that are loose at one end. As noted, you're not likely to see a tree this old in most urban landscapes, in that they've been constructed more recently, but it gives you a good idea of how magnificent these trees become with age, and also how big they become. So as you can see from the foliage, beautiful red color in the autumn, part of the reason it's called a red maple. Also, the flowers in the spring have red petals, and the buds are red in the spring as well, so aptly named. So a red maple. So we've been talking about some of the more regularly encountered and kind of basic tree species that you'll find in an urban forest. And there's a reason for that, there's certain trees will survive better and grow better in urban conditions than others. However, over time it's become apparent that it's necessary to mix up the list of species we're using to avoid outcomes where you have too many elm trees and Dutch elm disease, more recently emerald ash borer. For that reason, cities have been starting to expand the list of trees they plant in forests, in urban forests, and this is a good example. This is a Kentucky coffee tree. It's a native in Canada to the Carolinian forest in the extreme southwest of Ontario, down around Windsor and Point Pelee, but they've proven to be very adaptable trees, and surprisingly they grow very well under urban conditions. So one of the interesting things about this tree is that it has, for a broadleaf tree, it has the largest leaf of all of the native trees to Canada. So the leaves are compound, so one big petiole and rachis or central stalk, and then smaller attachments with individual leaflets. And this whole structure from here to here is a leaf, which is really quite interesting. It's another tree that grows as a fruit tree and separate from pollen-producing trees. The name Kentucky coffee tree is a reference to the fruit they produce, which is a flat pod, just like a bean, with what appear to be coffee beans inside, although they are nothing like coffee at all. These are becoming more and more common as an urban tree. They're fairly well suited to dry soils and hardy to about zone 5. So Kentucky coffee tree, really an interesting new urban forest tree. So another useful group of trees that you'll find in the urban forest landscape are oaks. And most people are able to identify an oak tree, although identifying the species is more problematic because there are many species to choose from. They divide up, for the most part, into two groups, the red oak group and the white oak group. Red oak trees having pointed lobes on the leaves and pointed buds, the white oak group having rounded lobes on the leaves and rounded buds. The tree we're looking at here is in the white oak group. It's called a bur oak, or Quercus macrocarpa, and that name refers to the structure of the acorn, which is a nut with a cap on the top, and the cap has a fringe of glands that make it look like a burdock, like a burr that gets stuck in your clothes, and hence the name bur oak. Moderately large tree. They could get to be 20 meters, 25 meters tall on an urban site, but moderately slow growing as well. Nonetheless, you need to think about the amount of space you have that can accommodate a tree that large. To identify this tree is not terribly difficult. The leaves are really quite characteristic. As mentioned, it's in the white oak group and it has rounded lobes on the leaves. But in the case of this tree, you'll notice that the central sinus between the lobes on the leaf itself are very deeply cut, so that you have a upper part of the blade of the leaf sort of divided from the lower part that's towards the tree on the petiole itself. That's a fairly consistent characteristic, although if you look through the leaves of any oak tree, you'll find there's a great deal of variety in their shape and size. Another interesting feature of this tree, unlike most white oak group species that have scaly bark, this tree tends to have long fissures with straight divides between them, and it's a little different than most of the other white oak trees, as noted. So bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, something I think you'll see more and more often in the urban landscape. Well, we've looked at a very short list of tree species today here at the Arboretum, all of which are good additions to an urban forest. But it's important to remember that there are many more species that you might think about, and many more that we can talk about in the space of a short video. I'd suggest, if you're interested in more kinds of tree species you can be using in a landscape, that you visit NRCan, Canadian Forest Service webpage, and download the NRCan My Tree phone app. And there you'll find information on 180 native and exotic tree species, information on the growing conditions that they favor, and most importantly, information on the hardiness zones where each of these tree species will grow, understanding that climates vary across Canada and from north to south, and it's very important to plant trees in an environment where they're going to grow and survive. So if you download that app and enter your location, it will give you a short list of all of the species that will grow in your area, or vice versa. You can enter a tree species and it will tell you if the tree will grow in your location or not. And in closing, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today in our walk through the Arboretum. Thanks.
If you like this video, let us know with a thumbs up. Click on the logo below to subscribe to the Simply Science channel, and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload new videos.